London, 1725. A funeral procession winds through the narrow streets of St. Olaf. A simple wooden coffin, a grieving crowd. A poor woman named Elizabeth making her final journey to the grave. At first, everything seems ordinary. Then someone says 4 words. They've sold her body. The effect is immediate. Heads turn, murmurs spread. A second voice joins in. She's going to the surgeons. Within moments, grief becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes anger. Hands reach for the coffin. Pallbearers stumble. The horse pulling the cart rears in panic. Someone shouts, "Stop them!" A crack of splintering wood echoes down the street. What should have been a quiet burial suddenly explodes into chaos. People shove, scream, fight. A church window shatters. Constables are overwhelmed. And at the center of it all sits a simple wooden coffin. Because in 18th century London, many people believed something terrifying, that even after death, the poor were not safe. This is the bizarre true story of the Resurrection Riot. Part 1. Elizabeth's Final Journey. History remembers very little about Elizabeth. No grand title, no famous family, no monument. Just a poor woman who lived and died in one of London's crowded working-class districts. Her life was probably much like thousands of others. Hard work, little money, constant uncertainty. But even the poorest Londoners hoped for one thing: a proper burial, a final resting place, a grave where family could mourn and a priest could say the proper words. That mattered, especially in a world where death was everywhere. For many people, burial wasn't simply tradition, it was dignity, respect, peace. But by 1725, a growing fear was spreading through London, a fear that made people question whether the dead were truly resting at all. Because across the city, rumors were everywhere. Fresh graves disturbed, coffins broken, bodies missing. People whispered about shadowy figures moving through churchyards at night, and they all seemed to be connected to the same destination, the surgeons. Soon, ordinary Londoners began to wonder, if a person could be poor in life, could they also be poor in death? And that question would soon push an already frightened city to its breaking point. Part 2. The Body Snatchers. When society wants something badly enough, someone will always find a way to supply it. In 18th century London, surgeons needed bodies, and that demand created an entire underground industry. The men who supplied those bodies were known as resurrectionists. It sounds almost heroic, as though they were bringing people back from the dead. The reality was far darker. Resurrectionists were professional grave robbers. They made their living stealing freshly buried corpses and selling them to anatomy schools and surgeons. And business was booming. Medical science was advancing rapidly. Doctors wanted to understand the human body. Students needed cadavers to learn from. But the law allowed only a small number of executed criminals to be dissected. There simply weren't enough bodies. So a black market emerged to fill the gap. Under cover of darkness, resurrectionists slipped into churchyards carrying shovels, ropes, and lanterns. They didn't usually dig up entire graves. That took too much time. Instead, they uncovered just enough of the coffin to break open the lid. Then they looped a rope around the corpse and pulled it free. The body disappeared into the night. The grave was hastily covered again. And by morning, few people could tell anything had happened. A fresh corpse could earn a resurrectionist several weeks' wages. Enough money to tempt desperate men. Enough money to encourage silence. Enough money to keep the trade alive. The wealthy protected themselves. They paid for heavy stone tombs, iron cages called mort safes, private guards. The poor had none of those options. Their graves were shallow, their coffins cheap, their families powerless. And before long, London's poorest residents realized something horrifying. Death did not guarantee peace. Even after burial, their loved ones could still be taken. Stories spread through taverns and crowded tenements. Families arrived at graveyards to find disturbed earth, broken coffins, missing bodies. Mothers sat beside fresh graves through the night, terrified to leave. The fear became so widespread that many people started seeing body snatchers everywhere. And when fear takes hold, rumors become powerful. Which is exactly what happened when Elizabeth died. Because by the time her funeral began, many people already believed the worst. They were simply waiting for proof. Part 3. The riot begins. The day of Elizabeth's funeral was cold and damp, the kind of London weather that seemed to settle directly into your bones. The procession moved slowly through the narrow streets. A simple coffin, a small crowd of mourners, a priest leading prayers. At first, everything seemed normal, but there was tension in the air. People along the route had already heard rumors. Too many rumors. Some claimed surgeons were desperate for bodies. Others claimed church officials were accepting money to look the other way. Most had no evidence. But fear rarely waits for evidence. As the procession moved closer to the churchyard, more people joined. Neighbors, curious onlookers, workers leaving nearby shops. The crowd grew larger and louder. Then someone spoke. "They've sold her." Nobody knows who said it first, but it didn't matter. The words spread instantly. "They've sold her body to the surgeons." Another voice joined in. "The sexton took money." Suddenly, people weren't attending a funeral anymore. They were witnessing what they believed was a crime. Faces hardened. Voices rose. The crowd pressed closer to the coffin. One of the pallbearers stumbled. Someone shouted, "Open it!" Another voice answered, "Show us she's still inside." Within seconds, the situation spiraled out of control. Hands grabbed the coffin. The cart lurched violently. The horse pulling it panicked. Constables tried to restore order. Nobody listened. Then came the sound that changed everything. Crack. The coffin lid split. For a brief moment, the crowd froze. Then chaos erupted. People surged forward, some trying to protect the coffin, others trying to tear it open. Everyone desperate to know the truth. Was Elizabeth still inside? Or had the body already been stolen? The churchyard became a battlefield. Shouting, pushing, fists flying. Constables overwhelmed. A stone crashed through a church window, sending stained glass raining onto the floor below. The funeral had become a riot, and Elizabeth's coffin now sat at the center of a public explosion years in the making. Because this was never really about one woman, or one funeral, or even one grave. It was about a city that no longer trusted the people responsible for protecting its dead. And by nightfall, all of London would be talking about it. Part 4. The city erupts. News traveled quickly in 18th-century London, especially bad news. By nightfall, stories about Elizabeth's funeral were spreading across the city, and like most stories passed from person to person, they grew more dramatic with every retelling. They tried to steal the body during the funeral. The church sold her to the surgeons. The coffin was empty. The grave robbers were caught in the act. Some versions were true, many were not. It hardly mattered. The fear behind them was real. In taverns and coffee houses, people argued about surgeons and body snatchers. Workers leaving factories discussed the riot on street corners. Market vendors repeated the story to customers. Before long, Elizabeth's funeral had become something larger than a local disturbance. It had become a symbol. To many Londoners, the riot confirmed what they had suspected for years. The dead were being treated as commodities, and the poor were paying the price. The anger wasn't directed at a single person. It was directed at an entire system. A system where wealthy families could protect their graves with stone vaults and iron barriers, while ordinary people had nothing but hope. Hope that nobody would come digging after dark. Hope that their loved ones would remain where they were buried. Hope that death would finally bring peace. The riot exposed how fragile that hope really was. And in the weeks that followed, fear only intensified. Families began watching graves more carefully. Neighbors organized overnight vigils. Fresh burials were guarded by relatives carrying lanterns through the darkness. Some people slept beside graves for days. Others carried weapons, not because they expected the dead to rise, but because they feared someone else would take them first. For London's poor, the battle over the dead had become personal. And although the riot eventually ended, the distrust remained. Because once people begin to suspect that even the grave is not sacred, it becomes very difficult to restore their faith. Part 5. What the riot really meant. At first glance, the Resurrection Riot seems almost unbelievable. A funeral, a rumor, a crowd losing control, the end. But not what happened. The riot was the result of years of fear finally boiling over. For wealthy Londoners, grave robbing was disturbing. For poor Londoners, it was terrifying. Because they understood something many people in power did not. The risk was never shared equally. The rich had protections. The poor did not. If a wealthy merchant died, his family could afford stone vaults and guards. If a laborer died, his family often had little more than a wooden coffin and a prayer. The same society that offered the poor few protections in life offered them few protections in death. That was the real source of the anger, not just body snatching. Inequality. The feeling that the people with the least power were once again being asked to bear the greatest burden, even if that burden followed them into the grave. And that's why Elizabeth's funeral mattered. Not because one coffin was damaged, not because a church window was broken, but because an entire community finally said enough. Enough fear. Enough rumors. Enough feeling powerless. For one explosive afternoon in 1725, ordinary people pushed back. And whether they were right or wrong about Elizabeth's body, they revealed a truth that London could no longer ignore. People will tolerate hardship for a long time, but eventually, every society discovers a limit. And sometimes that limit is reached in the most unexpected place imaginable: a funeral procession. And that is the story of the Resurrection Riot. The day a poor woman's funeral erupted into chaos and exposed one of the darkest fears haunting 18th-century London. A fear that the dead were being stolen, sold, and stripped of their final dignity. It remains a strange reminder that some of history's most explosive moments begin not with kings or wars, but with ordinary people refusing to stay silent. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and join us here on The Curious Past, where forgotten mysteries, bizarre crimes, and unbelievable true stories are brought back to life. And next time, we travel to 19th-century France for the story of a failed poet who became one of the country's most notorious criminals. A man who wanted fame so badly that he turned crime into performance, and eventually tried to make history with a bomb. Join us for The Exploding Poet, the criminal who refused to be forgotten. Until next time, stay curious.